Hello and welcome. I'm Margaret Scott with the New York Southeast Asia Network. We're delighted to have Greg Fealy, one of the leading scholars on Indonesia, join us at this momentous moment, seemingly everywhere. I urge you all to sign up for the network's newsletter. Now that the pandemic has turned everything virtual, very important events are happening and available to everyone who wants to sign up to them. I'd like to thank our coordinator, Srinath Poole, for organizing this, and thank NYU Wagner as a co-sponsor. This pandemic is raging not just in the United States, but also in Indonesia. Inequality and rates of newly impoverished people is soaring. Students and labor activists have hit the streets across the archipelago to protest a newly passed job creation bill. First Hong Kong, then Thailand, now Indonesia, there are protest movements led by young people. No one is better placed to help us understand what is going on than Greg Fealy, Associate Professor at the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University. He has been writing about Indonesian politics for a long, long time and been the most generous scholar I know. And I'm very, very honored to call him a friend. He's written extensively on the politics and culture of major Islamic parties and organizations such as Nahdlatul Ulama, PKS, and Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he specializes in Islam and politics. His most recent co-edited book is Contentious Belonging, The Place of Minorities in Indonesia. His talk today is based on an article soon to be published in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies and was featured in the 2020 ANU Indonesia Update. Greg will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will open up the conversation to questions from you. I'm sure you all know, we would like you to use the chat at the bottom of the screen and write up your questions. And Greg, I want to thank you deeply for agreeing to do this, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that warm invitation. And I'm really pleased. I've attempted on numerous occasions to actually appear in person at the New York Southeast Asia Network, and it's not happened for various reasons. And I'm glad that at least we can do it on an online basis today. So thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to the audience for your attention to what I'm going to be talking about, which is Jokowi, Indonesian politics over the last year, in fact, and the response to COVID, repressive pluralism, dynasticism. These are the main themes I'm going to be pursuing. So let me share with you my PowerPoint. There are not a lot of slides on it. So as President Joko Widodo, commonly known as Jokowi, marks the first year of his second 5-year term, observers have been searching for signs of whether this second half of his presidency will be markedly different from the first. Jokowi is aware that his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, was widely judged to have achieved little in his second term. And Jokowi is determined not to repeat this. Ever impatient, ever ambitious, Jokowi began his second term last year wanting not just to consolidate the attainments of his first term, but to far exceed those by launching much bolder, more visionary projects than he had in his first term between 2014 and 2019. He wanted to leave a monumental legacy, and he'd be remembered as a great builder of Indonesia, at least the equal of President Suharto, upon whom he partly models himself. The crowning achievement was to be the construction of a new capital city in his Kalimantan. But he had other goals as well, including continuing infrastructure development, expanding the industrial and technological sectors, improving skills and human capital through better education and training, and raising research and innovation capacity. In short, he wanted the 2019-2024 period to be one of transformation. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke in Indonesia in March 2020, it brought not only a potentially devastating public health crisis, but it also threatened to shatter Jokowi's grand plans. Achieving his second term objectives during stable economic conditions would have been challenging enough. Doing so in a time of recession and upheaval was near impossible. The combination of the COVID-19 crisis and his being a final term president appears to have sharply concentrated Jokowi's mind, leading him to discard many aspects of his broader social and political reform agenda and focus with single-minded intensity on what was most important to him, the economy and development. Many scholars have previously noted Jokowi's thin and attenuating commitment to rights and democratisation goals, often commenting that he supported them as long as they cost him little political capital and did not impact adversely on his economic plans. But now, with the economy in recession and the pandemic worsening, he has cast off most of his remaining progressive policies, seemingly with scant regret. Shorn of the nominally liberal outer layers of his political identity, we now see in clear view Jokowi's core preoccupations with material prosperity and advancement. Moreover, far from lowering expectations of what is achievable during his second term, Jokowi has doubled down, appearing to convince himself that the pandemic is a unique opportunity to bring about sweeping change and realise his dream of a powerful, highly developed Indonesia. This can be seen in his constant exhortation to Indonesians to be disciplined, to take on new and more productive mindsets and habits, to not be downcast by the current crisis, but to rise above it and behold the nation's glimmering prospects. Jokowi's determination is also evident in his prioritising of economic recovery over public health, his mobilisation of the military to enforce COVID protocols, his seeming indifference to the growing intimidation of government critics by state agencies and his supporters, and his willingness to allow extra legal means to suppress Islamism. Most of these tendencies have been apparent for several years, but they are now far more pronounced as he strives to impel Indonesians to fulfill their potential as he sees it and secure his place in history as a great president. One aspect of Jokowi's behaviour in the last year was new and unexpected, and that is dynasticism. Jokowi's rapid rise from local to national political leader was due in no small measure to a perception that he embodied many of the principles of Reformasi, including a disdain for the sorts of nepotistic practices that had defined the later Suharto era and persisted among much of the political elite since then. He had been asked repeatedly whether he wanted his children to follow him into politics, and he had always responded indifferently. Well, if they choose to, they can. And yet, over the past year, his son and his son-in-law launched their political careers with the blessing and the strong behind-the-scenes support of the president. Refusing to use one's position to advance the prospects of one's relatives proved to be another expendable principle for Jokowi as he set about ensuring his family's intergenerational entrenchment. Quite possibly, this shift in stance was also influenced by the crisis and by his own sense that he needs to have an ongoing national role after his presidency. So this talk is divided into really four main parts. I want to look very briefly at the COVID situation and summarise Jokowi's reaction to that. I know there's been a lot of discussion on this, and if someone wants really a superb analysis of Indonesia's COVID response, you might read Markus Mietzner's recent article on that. It has very penetrating analysis. Secondly, I want to look at securitization of the COVID response and civil administration. Thirdly, I want to look at repressive pluralism and this attempt to roll back Islamism. And last of all, I want to look at dynasticism in the setting not only of the coming regional elections in December of this year, but also the 2024 presidential elections. So, COVID. Here are the figures as of a couple of days ago. So you can see there, these figures are known to many people. about 370,000 COVID cases, approaching 13,000 deaths, and also approaching 300,000 people recovered. In the last week, Indonesia has again become the most seriously affected country in Southeast Asia for COVID cases, exceeding that of the Philippines. This is just a couple of brief graphs that come from the Worldometer pages, and this shows this rising curve for case numbers, and then a similar rising curve, not quite as steep, for the total deaths. So, and this is taken from the World Health Organization. The provinces in red are the most seriously affected provinces for COVID, orange, less severe, and yellow, the least severely affected. So you can see that the pandemic has spread across pretty much all of Indonesia, and I want to focus on how Jokowi has responded to this, because COVID-19 has been the severest challenge of his presidency. It's also tested Indonesia's capacity as a state to deal with the pandemic and its public health and economic consequences. So if we look at how Jokowi has responded, initially he seemed confident and no doubt reassured by the statements of various of his ministers, most prominent among them his health minister, Terawan, that Indonesia may not be impacted, may not be affected by the pandemic. And this initially in February, like January, February, led Jokowi to talk about Indonesia being a safe haven from the virus and talking up the prospects of tourism and investment in that setting. The first case, confirmed case, occurred in Indonesia on the 2nd of March. And this really became the beginning of Jokowi's dilemma as to whether he prioritized public health or whether he prioritized the continued growth of the economy. He has zigzagged at times over the last 7-8 months on this, but his default setting has been to prioritize the economy and to try and persuade people to do as many of the public health measures that they can, to follow the protocols as they can, without jeopardizing or to minimize the negative economic impact of that. But a lot of this has been done in a very half-hearted and often confusing way. Indonesia has not been well served by contradictory statements, often not very clear statements by various ministers, and also by tussles taking place between the national government and regional governments. The most obvious of these has been at times the struggle between Jakarta, between Jokowi's government and the Jakarta governor, Anies Baswedan, who Jokowi sees as a political foe. So I think a lot of this is already quite recorded, so I won't go into much detail. What I will say is that we have seen since July a growing bullishness on Jokowi's part, based seemingly on his conviction now that he has the right policy mix to keep the pandemic under control without doing great harm to the economy. Now, you recall the charts that I showed before, and it's clear that the pandemic is not at all under control. But he's made a number of very telling speeches that I think reveal much about his mindset. He spoke to the People's Consultative Assembly, the NPR, in mid-August, and he likened COVID to a computer crash that would require Indonesia to, quote, reboot its economy. But he said that this would turn, and I quote, turn the crisis into an opportunity to make great leaps. He's repeatedly making references to great leaps forward, to great advances that Indonesia can make out of the pandemic. And he talked about our patterns of thinking and work ethic have to change. Flexibility, flexibility, speed and precision are very much needed. Efficiency, collaboration, technology usage have to be prioritized. National discipline and national productivity must be raised. He went on to refer to the transformation of the economy from procedure-driven to results-driven, from standard work to outstanding work, from complicated long procedures to smart shortcuts. In these words, we can see both Jokowi's vision for an advanced Indonesia, but we can also sense his frustration and perhaps his despair that the country is not already an advanced one. His speech makes clear how he's come to view the deep disruption of daily life caused by COVID as a precious opportunity to hasten long overdue reforms. Nonetheless, his optimism appears fanciful, as if deep structural and cultural problems that hinder Indonesia's economic development might be quickly cast aside like a captive's shackles, liberating a nation to attain its rightful success. So I now move to the second topic, and that is the securitization of COVID measures and public administration. One of the most important aspects of Jokowi's COVID management strategy has involved his use of the armed forces and the state intelligence agency BIN. Of course, many governments across the world have mobilized their armed forces to assist the police and civilian agencies in dealing with the pandemic. Given the magnitude of the problem, this mobilization has been broadly accepted within those nations as a justifiable use of the military in extraordinary times. But in the Indonesian case, several aspects of Jokowi's policy are distinctive. First, it follows a trend throughout his presidency of widening the role of the security apparatus, not only the military and intelligence, but also the police. Second, TNI, the Indonesian Armed Forces, has been granted powers to directly sanction civilians, and that is unusual in the global context. Third, TNI and BIN had pursued roles in the production of anti-COVID medicine and COVID testing when they lacked the expertise to do so. By pursuing these policies, Jokowi is securitizing the management of social and political problems beyond what is required. Rather than seeing social and political problems as primarily matters for civilian authorities with assistance provided by TNI and BIN, they are instead designated as security threats and thereby justifying the use of extraordinary measures by the state in response. The result of this securitization process is that the military, police and intelligence agencies now have wider scope for intervention in society than at any time since the early days of Reformasi in the late 1990s. This is now, I would argue, a contributing factor in Indonesia's democratic regression, in its backsliding in the quality of its democracy. I don't have time to go through the details of the Jokowi's rollout of TNI, but just a few figures might suffice. Some 340 military and police personnel were mobilized in order to enforce the COVID protocols, and this was the case across the country. Some 83,000 villagers were meant to be mentored, the word used by the Indonesian government, to ensure correct COVID behaviour and also in dispensing the vaccine when it becomes available. Also, senior TNI officers were appointed to a variety of command roles in COVID operations. The best known of those would be Lieutenant General Doni Monadi, who headed up the COVID task force, and then more recently, the commander of the Army, General Andika Perkasa, to be the deputy head of the Committee for COVID Management and National Economic Recovery. These appointments are consistent with a range of other appointments that Jokowi has made of generals who are very well connected to political families and who now hold strategic positions in various parts of Indonesia's armed forces. Some commentators, particularly in Indonesia, have argued that this is a return to the New Order period, that Jokowi is returning to a Suharto-esque use of the military, which will mean they will have much greater direct involvement in politics. Jun Hona, a very experienced analyst of the Indonesian military, has argued very convincingly, I think, that Jokowi, although he was using the military in an instrumentalized way to make him appear a strong and resolute leader, he is not doing so with the intention of bringing TNI back into politics. Jokowi's use of the military has a number of practical benefits for him. He believes that the military are much more efficient than his own public service. He's clearly fed up from a number of statements that have been released from when he's rebuked cabinet. He's fed up with the dilatory, the torpid response of his own bureaucrats to the COVID crisis. And he believes the military can operationalise COVID measures far more quickly than what civilians can do. He also believes, perhaps not without some basis, that the public are much more likely to follow orders from a military officer than they are from a civilian. But nonetheless, there remains the issue of whether this is in accord with the 2004 TNI law, which says that the primary role of the military is the defence of the nation. There is also a practical benefit for TNI because they use the COVID rollout, they use the COVID involvement as a way of defending their territorial structure. And this is crucial to TNI maintaining this parallel structure to the civilian administration across the nation. So that is a key strategic goal for TNI, which is being served by this. I now come to the State Intelligence Agency, BIN, and well, actually, let me deal with the police next. The police have also received very favourable treatment from Jokowi, and many analysts believe this is in response to the police being helpful to Jokowi during the last election campaign in his previous term. He's appointed a record number of police generals, more than 30 in fact, by mid-2020, to senior civil service positions in government, state-owned enterprises and independent state agencies, such as the Anti-Corruption Commission. According to the NGO Contrast, there are a total of 397 police officers in state-owned enterprises, up from 222 just 2 years ago. So more than 7% of all state-owned enterprise commissioners now have police backgrounds. Quite often these police are being appointed to fields well outside their area of expertise in the law and law enforcement. And the third agency to benefit from Jokowi's securitization process has been the National Intelligence Agency, BIN. Jokowi has used them repeatedly to try and persuade society to adopt certain measures. So very early on, he asked BIN to take steps, and I quote, take steps in managing COVID, and also to help with public health. This has meant that both BIN and the Army have become involved in developing a much criticised COVID medicine in collaboration with Erlanger University in Surabaya. BIN has also rolled out its own testing vans, and there's been much negative comment in the Indonesian media about how unreliable these vans have turned out to be. Jokowi also favoured BIN by allowing them to answer directly to him rather than to the Coordinating Minister of Politics, Law and Security, Mahfud, which has been the case throughout the Reformasi era. This means BIN has direct access to the President. There is no filtering or scrutiny of the reports of the advice they're giving to him via the Coordinating Minister, as has been the case in the past. And most people would deem that an enhancement of BIN's position. All of this comes at a time, this increase in the role of TNI, the police, and the State Intelligence Agency comes at a time where there has been growing, sorry, I just lost my page. There has been growing intimidation of government critics, particularly using cyber technology, resulting in a significant squeezing of the civic space. Many activists find that their accounts are hacked, that they are trolled. The Indonesian word for this is the use of buzzers. And this seems to be done on a systematic basis in a way which is, it causes a great deal of stress for those that are so targeted. Many observers believe that it's most likely to be state agencies that are undertaking much of this work because they are the only agencies that have the technical capacity to do so at the kind of high intensity that we are finding. So these events may be connected. This attempt to lessen public dissent, to punish dissenters or critics of the Jokowi government, and also this expansion in the role of the military, the police and intelligence agencies in a wide range of government programs. This brings me to the third topic, and perhaps the one which has aroused the most controversy, and that is repressive pluralism, what I'm calling repressive pluralism. Why have I called it this? Because at the moment, the government has been undertaking over the last few years an increasingly aggressive campaign to against Islamists, to restrict what they see as hardline Islamic views, which they believe pose an existential threat to Indonesia's tradition of diversity and tolerance. The government is doing this in the name of pluralism, arguing that Islamists imperil religious and political freedoms and thus warrant suppression. This pluralist Islamist cleavage has become one of the most significant fault lines now in the Reformasi era, and is now a critical site for contestation over the nature of Indonesia's democracy. And the question that needs to be asked is, are pluralists justified in using illiberal measures to combat supposedly illiberal forces of Islamism? My view of this is no, but I know there are many people who will have a contrary view, and I'm happy to discuss that later in the question and answer session. So pluralism is generally defined as an acknowledgement or an acceptance that no one religion or no one group can be the sole source of truth, and that therefore the state and groups in society should acknowledge and accommodate a diversity of beliefs. In Indonesia, this is very often encapsulated in the term Bhinneka Tunggal or Kebinekaan, diversity, and that holds, and this is seen as an essential part of Indonesia's religiously neutral character. When I refer to Islamism, I'm referring to those groups that seek to bring Islamic law and principles formally into the public domain, to Islamize public life. It's not just principles, but they want Islamic law to be much more comprehensively enacted. So who are the pluralists in this category? At the core, there are two groups, broad groups. The first is PDIP and its supporter base, the Indonesian Party of Democracy, the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, the party led by Megawati Soekarno Putri. And the other twin pillar in this is the traditionalist Islamic organisation, Indonesia's largest, Nahdlatul Ulama, and also its vast array of affiliated organisations and its political party, PKP, the National Awakening Party. Both PDIP and NU see themselves as representing the moral centre of the nation's pluralist traditions. Aside from NU and PDIP, there is also a diverse range of parties such as Golkar, Gerindra, Hanura, even the United Development Party, which in some ways is Islamist, but on these issues favours the crackdown. For the pluralists, the Islamists are not just people who want to enact Islamic law and principles in society. They have a particular dislike for what they regard as transnational Islam. Islamic groups that they think more recently founded Islamic movements in Indonesia that have much more direct links to particularly the Middle East, to a lesser extent South Asia. Groups in this category are the now banned Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, the Muslim Brotherhood inspired Prosperous Justice Party, PKS, and also more puritanical groups such as Salafists and also Jama'at Tabligh, which is one of the South Asia-based groups. The degree of, I'm just looking at the time and I'll need to truncate this a little bit, but concern among pluralist communities about the rise of Islamists was really reached a much higher level as a result of the massive anti-Ahok protests in Jakarta. But also there's been, and everyone will know about that, but also they often refer to a wealth of survey data pointing to a growing intolerance in Indonesia's education system, both tertiary and secondary system, not only among students, but also among teachers who are skeptical about Indonesia's religious neutrality or principles of Pancasila, teachers and students who would like to see the country have much more Sharia than what it has currently. So this has led to a campaign by the government to target Islamists, particularly in the public sector, but also it's now happening in the private sector. And in universities, in state-owned enterprises, in ministries, lists are circulating of supposed Islamists. And those Islamists are often called up to their supervisors and warned about their activity. It might be the sorts of things they are looking at online. It might be their political affiliations. And often they are regarded as extremist, but this term extremist is never properly defined. Sometimes they are threatened with marginalisation in their careers unless they change their behaviour. Sometimes they may be even threatened with loss of their work. Candidates for the public service are also in many ministries now being screened to determine whether they have Islamist values. So in an organisation such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is banned, one can mount an argument that there is some justification for the government seeking to root out Hizb ut-Tahrir supporters within their midst. But for supporters, for example, of PKS or for members of Salafist groups, these are legal organisations. They have broken no law. PKS has been a major Islamic party in Indonesia since the start of Reformasi. It's provided ministers to governments. There is nothing PKS does that is formally breaking any law. So on what basis is the government discriminating against them, intimidating followers in these positions? This is now becoming a major human rights issue. And sadly, the people who are often endorsing these kinds of campaigns are people who are doing so in the name of pluralism. So what Indonesia now has is an increasingly selective form of pluralism, which I would argue is not genuine pluralism at all, which is not in keeping with the principles of Kebinekaan. Let me move to the last topic, which is that of dynasticism, and I've forgotten to move my slides. I'm very sorry about that, Margaret and everyone who's watching me. I mentioned before the name of General Andika Perkasa, and there's the military helping people to instruct them on how to wear masks properly. Someone who hasn't followed the protocols has been made to sweep the street, and there's just Jokowi in military uniform. And Pandu Riono is one of the people whom I mentioned whose account was hacked. He's the government's really the main critic of their COVID campaign, and his account was hacked. Images were uploaded onto that account and then distributed to his networks in an attempt to discredit and embarrass him. Just one example of this. Repressive pluralism, I won't need to go too much into that. Let me come to now dynasticism. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Jokowi, one of the attractive elements, I think, in his political persona is this notion that he is free from corruption, and I think most people believe that is the case, but that he's also not nepotistic. He hasn't got the elitist mindset of most other leading politicians, and he certainly hasn't come from an elite family. So it was particular surprise when his son, Gibran, pictured here, nominated for the mayoralty of Surakarta, Solo, in central Java, which was a city where his father had been a two-time mayor. In addition to that, his son-in-law, Bobby Nasution, of whom I have a photo just up here with Jokowi, also nominated to become mayor of the North Sumatran city of Medan. So both Gibran and Bobby are political neophytes. They're very young, they'd had no previous involvement in politics. And indeed, they hadn't had a record of making statements about political issues at all. They are known as business people. When they nominated, Jokowi said that they were doing so of their own volition, that he had nothing to do with it. It would be a breach of their rights to try to stop them from nominating, as every Indonesian citizen has the ability to do so. So he would not stand in their way. So he gave the impression that he was at arm's length from the process. It soon became apparent, though, that that was not the case. Information from within the palace makes clear that Jokowi had been pressuring his family members to consider a political career, that he was disappointed that none of his family members wanted to follow him into politics. As a result of that, Gibran made the decision to run for Solo, and quite possibly that was the reason for Bobby to run for Medan as well. More than that, we can see very clearly how Jokowi intervened to try to ease the path of Gibran's election campaign in Solo. One of the people who had previously been a rival for that nomination within the PDIP party, I should mention that Gibran was being nominated by PDIP, a man called Purnomo, was invited to Jakarta to meet the president, have lunch in the palace. Purnomo later told the media that Jokowi had offered him a very lucrative position in Jakarta if I mean, it wasn't directly connected to him not causing problems for Gibran's election campaign, but everyone assumed that that was the deal. And he rejected the offer, by the way, and he later joined a rival campaign. So Jokowi's use of not only presidential office, but his presidential facilities for what was basically a family political matter drew very sharp comment from a lot of people. Why is Jokowi doing this? Partly, I think he does believe that his children have the right to go into politics, but he's being disingenuous in saying that he's not encouraging it. There's also, I suspect, a covert element here as well, where Jokowi believes that his brand of politics, his style of leadership, holds the solutions that Indonesia needs to make it a much more prosperous country in the future. If he can help to maneuver his children into prominent positions, he increases the possibility that this brand of policy making and political leadership will have a much longer term impact on the country. He's no doubt also learning from what other elite families do, and he may well reason that his children are no less able than any of the children of other elite families. His vice president has two relatives who are running in the December election campaign. December regional elections. I should mention that all the information suggests that those December direct elections of regional heads are likely to be the most dynastic in Indonesia's history, with record numbers of members of existing political families nominating themselves for those local positions. I should also say this is not just about Jokowi's own family. Within the ruling coalition, many of the families and parties that are positioning themselves for the 2024 election are using the dynasticism relating to this year's regional elections in order to get advantage for 4 years' time. Megawati and Prabowo, the respective leaders of PDIP and Gerindra, both key parts of Jokowi's coalition, are hoping to put together, as things stand at the moment, a team of Prabowo and Megawati's daughter, Puan Maharani, currently the Speaker of the Indonesian Parliament, that they will be the PDIP Gerindra team for the 2024 presidential election. And they are hoping that by supporting Jokowi's two family members, Jokowi will in turn support them in 2024. I'm not so sure that he will, because their polling figures at the moment are looking rather weak, and Jokowi doesn't like backing losers. So this kind of calculation, Jokowi's willingness to engage in dynasticism, has made him susceptible to the broader set of manoeuvres and machinations designed to give advantage to the coming presidential election. I think I'll leave it there, Margaret. I've got through most of the material that I wanted to present, but I'm happy to answer questions on anything that I might have glossed over briefly. And I look forward to the comments that people may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. That was quite a meaty take on things, and adds to a growing literature on the decline of the quality of democracy in Indonesia, but does in a very particularly interesting way. And I'm going to throw out this question. After the anti-Ahok movement, and in the years since, there was quite a bit of evidence that growing intolerance was in fact true, and that a lot of anti-democratic actors were infiltrating state sector, universities, even student organizations, even the finance ministry. And so the question that I guess needs to be asked is, you do a wonderful critique of what was done wrong to deal with tendencies of majoritarian views of democracy and very intolerant views of the role of minorities in society, all kinds of things. What would you have advocated as another path rather than repressive pluralism?
Thank you for the question, Margaret. I'm glad you give me the opportunity to talk a bit more about this subject. And you're absolutely correct. Growing intolerance, I mean, this is something I and many people have written about. The Islamist penetration of government, that's really the flip side of this. And it's something, because I've done quite a bit of research on some of the Islamist organisations, I've seen this at first hand. I've heard party activists talking about this directly, so I know it happens. The question is, what is the best way to, and I should say that Islamists are not the only people who do this. Innu people do it, Muhammadiyah people do it. They have ministries that they regard as their bastions, and they're very unhappy if they don't control them. And there's a bare minimum of people from other organisations who really get a look in those ministries. So this kind of favouritism goes on across Indonesian politics. It's not the exclusive preserve of Islamists, but the Islamists can be particularly aggressive in this front. And you mentioned the case of the finance ministry is very well known. LPDP, the scholarship organisation, was another where there was a disproportionate representation of people of Islamist backgrounds, and some of their actions were prejudicial to some of the applicants for scholarships and things like that. So there are grounds on which action could be taken. However, what worries me about the current campaign is the sheer vagueness of it, where people in authority within an organisation, be it government or private enterprise, are given lists, and we don't know the details of how those lists are drawn up. But often loose terms such as Islamist or particularly extremist are readily bandied around, and are liberally applied to groups like PKS or Salafism, Salafis, and so on. And how are we defining extremists? So in the case of PKS, what is extremist about it? I think that's a misnomer, but it's being used to justify prejudicial action to them by the state. So it's not an open process. They haven't broken any laws or indeed any regulation. So this is the kind of thing which actually generates resentment and grievance, and it can have its own radicalising effects in the longer term. The other thing about it is it's very indiscriminate. So there have been, for example, students who have graduated from overseas universities in all sorts of fields, have returned to Indonesia. They have at various times joined PKS groups when they were doing their study abroad. You know, religious groups, that's where they would go to pray and things like that. When they return to Indonesia, they find that their name is on a list and they are warned about their affiliation. Now, in some cases, people are no more than acquaintances of PKS groups. It can be a very loose connection that they have. They're not necessarily members. Even if they were members, would that be grounds for this kind of action? But many of these people believe that they've been extremely unfairly treated. That they are in other ways very capable to get advancement within their careers. They have all the qualifications, they've done the hard work, but they're being blocked because of a perceived connection to these Islamist groups. So that's where it is discriminatory and unfair. That's where it is contrary to the principles of pluralism, I would argue. And I think there are ways in which this can be much more accurately dealt with. For example, if you have a monopoly in a particular area held by Islamists who are behaving in a discriminatory way towards non-Islamists, well, then you have regulatory processes. You can say, why did you ask a female applicant why she wasn't wearing a hijab? Why did you ask her how many times she'll pray each day? Those are not professional questions to ask. They are grounds for your removal from this selection panel. Those types of systems are in place in many countries in the world to stop favoritism, to stop bias in selection processes. They can be introduced in Indonesia. In some ways, it's a lazy way to just get a list and say, you are now excluded because you are on this list. As an Islamist or an extremist, you're on this list. That's the risk, I think.
Thanks. And also the backlash that probably will be coming is also important to stress. Yeah. I'm going to go to a couple of questions. This one's from Sydney Jones. Who in the political elite, other than NU, most benefits from Jokowi's anti-Islamist turn? The anti-Ahok protests were important, but who in his inner circle have been most influential in pushing him towards this position, and why?
I think there's a lot of people pushing towards this. So one thing I didn't get to talk about was PDIP's increasingly ideological campaign that it is running. Within PDIP, they believe that Pancasila, that Sukarnoism is an antidote to Islamism. And this is one group that believes the second Jokowi term is a critical period. If they don't act now in suppressing Islamism, well then it might be too powerful in the future to do anything about it. I know academics in universities like University of Indonesia and Gadjah Mada who have the same point of view in their own universities. They are welcoming in the State Intelligence Agency because they think the Islamists are on the threshold of having a stranglehold on key parts of those universities, particularly in technical faculties and the like. My own reading of that is that is exaggerating their influence, but nonetheless, that is their perception. So there are a wide range of forces. It's not only PDIP. NU, of course, has been waging a quite trenchant campaign against transnational Islam, Wahhabism and the like. Those terms are often used. It's been waging that campaign for really the best part of a decade. Some would argue since the organisation was founded, but it's become particularly determined about this in the last few years. But I think many of these other forces, I mentioned other parties in the coalition, there are a great many people who have come to be really wary of Islamists. And they do object to what they see as the intolerant values that are being taught. And indeed, some of those values are intolerant. I'm not denying that. The question is how you respond to that. Do you respond to that through reasoned argumentation by putting forward principles of pluralism and tolerance and the like, or do you do it through trying to exclude people? So there are also no doubt government agencies that see the combating of Islamism as something that's in their interest. Quite a few of these agencies have people who are close to political parties, and so the possibility that there would be less Islamist threat to those political parties in future might be something that was in their interests. Looking ahead to the 2024 election, one of the candidates who's polling very well at the moment is the governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan. Many Islamists, after Prabowo basically turned his back on them and joined the Jokowi government, many Islamists are now looking to Anies Baswedan as their great political hope for the future. So if I was someone in government close to PDIP, I would find it, or close to Garindra for that matter, I would find it in my interest to try to politically neuter Islamism, because that would weaken the possibility of Anies Baswedan having a strong chance at the presidency in 2024. But he's very well placed at the moment. So I think we have those kinds of calculations as well.
Great, thank you. I have another question from someone from SUNY Albany, Asari Edi. Jokowi in his presidency has been persistently punishing critical voices with accusations of being mobilized by partisan interest of the opposition elites. To what extent has this policy become a legacy and further institutionalized in the way the Indonesian state deals with civil society in the future? Meaning, will this approach become the way the state functions in the future, I think is what.
I think that's a great concern. Many scholars have written about Indonesia's democratic reversal over the last 10 years in particular. And I think this is a fear that the COVID situation, all those things that I set out at the beginning of the talk, that we will see an acceleration of that process during COVID and during Jokowi's second term. And I agree entirely about this squeezing, this crimping of civic space for dissent, and the view that dissent is something that is unhelpful at this stage, is something that Indonesia can't afford. So to have activists who are using social media to criticise the government, clearly a lot of people in government believe that those people are legitimate targets for response in order to silence their voices. And I think the involvement of government agencies in this, that's where the expansion of security services heightens the risk of further repression, suppression than what we've had even up until now. So the trend lines are almost all heading in the wrong direction. I mean, we need to keep this in balance. Indonesia is still the most democratic country in Southeast Asia. No country in Southeast Asia is regarded by Freedom House as fully democratic or fully free, but Indonesia is somewhat more democratic than other countries. So that's a good thing, but nonetheless, it continues to slide down in the rankings. And I think after the events of the past year, that trend will continue in the next few years when we look at the international assessments of how democratic Indonesia is. And there are very few voices within the current Jokowi government who are advocates of arresting this process, advocates of free speech. And I think there's something to do with this kind of group psychology within the ruling coalition, which is going to see more restrictions rather than less.
I can't help but add a two-finger to that, and that is if you could include the recent protests against the job creation bill, which has been by and large labor activists and students. How does that fit into your view of this decline of democratization and the possibility that stopping dissent it will become more institutionalized because people have actually been out on the streets, and what it means about the robustness or not of civil society?
Well, this is a very good example. Jokowi earlier in the year asked the state intelligence agency, BIN, to help persuade people to accept the omnibus bill. And you would have to ask, in a democracy, why would a president ask an intelligence agency to do that? The mere involvement of intelligence agency would often make people somewhat fearful that the intelligence agency might be looking at their own activities. He also asked the police to do something similar as well. So Thomas Power wrote about this very well in an article a couple of years ago, also in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies. And so this trend of Jokowi to use state institutions for his political purposes, he no doubt sees this as something which is for the good of the country. But if that's the case, why don't his ministers get out there and sell the case directly to students, to labour unions and the like? Why use an agency that is a security agency for that purpose? Is clearly open to abuse. And so that's a very good example of why it's so problematic to expand, to securitize these aspects of really relations between government and civil society. For the protests themselves, I know one of the views that we've heard is that this is actually having quite a harmful effect on civil society, because there are groups that in fact favour the passage of the omnibus law and favour the crackdown against the protesters. It's a somewhat similar situation to what we find with the polarisation within the Islamic community. I mentioned before about the pluralist Islamist polarisation. A lot of NGOs that would once have defended the rights of Islamists now don't do so. And I think of the case of Novel Baswedan, the senior investigator for the KPK, who was who had acid thrown in his face and was almost blinded by that attack. Quite a few NGOs were reluctant to defend him because word spread that he was a transnational Muslim. He was a Salafist. He had these very conservative practices. Look at his beard, look at the white skull cap he wears. There were lots of stories on social media about that, and lots of NGO people who would normally have sprung to his defence, who were reluctant to do so because they thought he was on the other side. He was an Islamist. And that's a way in which the polarisation that we see can have a very harmful effect on the quality of civic life in Indonesia, because it does have that all or nothing category element to it. We see it with the protests against the omnibus law. We saw it in the past with, and we see it now, in fact, now there's public discussion on the repression of Islamism. We see the same kinds of things there, where groups that espouse liberal values, espouse progressive values, say, actually, there has to be an exception to this. And the exception is Islamism, or the exception is the students who are protesting on the streets for measures that will in actual fact make the economy stronger, or provide more employment or something like that. So I think that trend line is also concerning.
So more than fracturing of civil society, it's the deepening of polarization, so that people don't choose on the merits or the principles of anything. They choose on which side you're on.
I think so.
Is that what you think?
So. And I think the effort to say that we can do this upholding rule of law and upholding principles of fairness, if there is behaviour, for example, on the Islamists, if there is behaviour that, if there are injurious things that are happening as a result of Islamist capture of sections of the public service, well then, how do we address that? For someone not to be, for example, someone not to be enamoured of Pancasila, that's not a crime. That's not against any law. People, however many people think it's desirable for Pancasila to be universally accepted in Indonesia, the reality is it's never going to be. It never really has been. And people have various levels of enthusiasm for that. But to deny someone a position in public service, for example, because they are Pancasila skeptics, or because they would want further enactment of Sharia law, when there is no law or regulation against that, well, then that is an inherent breach of their rights, I think. And the hard work is to come up with detailed measures that would fairly, within the rule of law, restrict activities that could also be regarded as undemocratic or promotion of intolerance and the like. So I just think that those harder measures are not being pursued by groups.
Great. In this repressive pluralism, in your view, you say that PKS is one of the targets of it. PKS is a huge organization that has been in the ruling coalition many times. What has been their response to this notion that their lists and PKS people are labeled as extremists and on it? Have they responded to your article in particular, and have they responded to this campaign in general?
I've had a lot of text messages from PKS people, some of whom have been sources of information about this, expressing relief that that I've written about it. In public, I haven't followed this closely because of pressures of work, but I've seen several PKS people claiming that it's not a problem, and I don't. I'm fairly sure that that's not the view held behind closed doors, whether I agree with my article or not, but I know it is a matter of concern across PKS. People have concerns for their careers, for example. They have concerns about the price they will pay for making a political choice to support PKS. And so I think the feeling is that there's no benefit to the party in drawing attention to this. The more it becomes a matter of debate, the more it's likely to be harmful for PKS people. It's better to keep a low profile, to focus on other elements of your political agenda and not to make a big issue of this. I think I haven't been able to travel to Indonesia for some time, so I haven't been able to talk in detail about it, but I suspect that's the view, and they wouldn't be the only group that's taken that view as well. I'm
going to go to one more, and then I have two more questions. The first one is, thank you for a great presentation. This is from Daniel Owigra. Could you elaborate more the history behind the use of pluralism as a strategy to gain power? And what is the meaning of pluralism from the perspective of the Jokowi government? Does it include LGBT? Does it have a view of pluralism for Papua?
Yes, thank you for the question. It would be wrong in a way to characterise parties as using pluralism to gain power. They have a broad set of ideologies and interests that are impelling all sorts of parties to gain power for different reasons. Specifically, but those in power, the parties that are part of this coalition, really since going back to the late Yudhoyono period, because Yudhoyono was seen as someone who made excessive concessions to Islamist sentiment. And from in the early days of the run-up to Jokowi's election, or the 2014 election, 14 election, PDIP and NU leaders were talking a lot about how they had to consolidate the centre of Indonesia. And what was that centre? It was a pluralist, tolerant, religiously neutral centre. It was something that fervently upheld Pancasila and the principles set out in the 1945 Constitution, and that these principles were being undermined by Islamists, by these people who were less tolerant, who were more exclusive. These people posed a threat to the fabric of Indonesian society and to its traditions. So that began to take hold then, and there was efforts to tighten the alliance between these two forces, sort of NU and PDIP. So so-called secular nationalism, not really an appropriate term any longer on the one hand with PDIP, and traditional Islam for NU. That was the kind of starting point. As the political interests have aligned and moved out of sync between PDIP and PKB, for example, NU's party, it hasn't been a consistent path all the way through, where both are in lockstep. They've pursued their interests, and sometimes in a contrary way and sometimes together. But nonetheless, our underlying current is still apparent in the kind of language we see about the repression of Islamism now. That it's pluralism that has to be protected, that we are the custodians, we are the guardians of this wonderful Indonesian tradition. And that's why I think these parties are determined to use the remaining years of Jokowi's second presidency to indisputably gain ascendancy over the Islamist groups. I would just add, I think people, I know you referred to the survey work before about the rising power of Islamism, on how the Islamists have captured ideas. But if you have a look politically at the moment, that whole movement that overthrew Ahok, that 212 movement, it's highly fragmented. Its ability to mobilise people is a fraction of what it was 3-4 years ago. Their main political champion, Prabowo, has turned his back on them and walked away and left them in disarray. They don't have a clear political vehicle now. To some extent, some people would say PKS, but PKS is not going to be advancing the things that they want. So there's not really a strong Islamist voice. People will instrumentalise those Islamists come election time, but I'm not convinced there's this trajectory of Islamist influence is going upwards. In fact, I think it has gone down again in the last year, and is probably going to go down further before it's got a chance of rising, perhaps in the on the eve of the 2024 election.
Interesting. We'll see.
We will see.
I think we need to end it because we're over time. But Greg, I can't thank you enough. And also, Greg, you have to now do 2.5 hours of another Zoom. So thank you everybody for joining us. And this will be on our website in a while. Thank you, Neith, and thank you, Greg.